Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to have such a big audience for the first panel this afternoon. The topic that we're going to discuss, a big theme, which is the theme of the implications of the fourth industrial revolution for Latin America. Fascinating. And I have the privilege of having probably the best qualified panel to talk about the topic, both from corporation and private entities standpoint, from the standpoint of public and government, and then I also rely on my panelists out there to kind of combine the views and provide a combined view of public and private when time comes. My name first, Gianfranco Casati. I'm Group Chief Executive for Growth Markets at Accenture. Growth Markets means, in our terms, means all Asia Pacific, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. So quite a spread number of countries around the world, and a unique point of observation on what's going on now that China has accelerated and is becoming one of the big players in the fourth industrial revolution. But before we jump on the theme, let me just say that when they gave me the theme of the fourth industrial revolution, I said, okay, let me check what the first, the second, and the third, in case somebody asks. And I said, okay, the first one was the one with water and steam, and the first adopters were Great Britain and North America. And frankly, with the second industrial revolution, the one with the electricity, the US took over Great Britain as the largest economic power of the world. So for the first two industrial revolutions, the center of innovation was the UK and the US. In the third industrial revolution, fast forwarding, is when industrial automation and electronics have started to make a substantial and fundamental impact in the way things were manufactured and distributed. And at that point in time, while US has been the center of the innovation again, other countries have joined the club, and in particular Japan and South Korea have stepped up in terms of being key players in that third industrial revolution. And here we are with the fourth industrial revolution. What we talk about here is what digital technologies, new technologies can enable in terms of transforming the way companies manufacture, distribute, and consumer use products and services. And when we talk about digital, we rapidly go into the space of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And again, while US continues to be at the center and the forefront of innovation, new players are adding up, and in particularly, notably, China is a big player in the fourth industrial revolution. So there is a dynamic which is, on one hand, historical, and the other hand, there are geographies that are joining the club of the big drivers for innovation. The discussion today will be more around, so what is in for Latin America, and what is the opportunity and the challenges for Latin America. Three main themes that I like the panelists to focus on, and I'm sharing with you. The first one is there is no common view and common agreement on the economic and social implications of the fourth industrial revolution. And frankly, none of the countries I've mentioned have figured out the right balance and the right equation in terms of economic and social value and implications for the fourth industrial revolution. The second big theme, which also triggers some controversy, and we were talking about that while we were preparing for the panel, is all the notion of the trust of big data. Who owns the data? The data privacy is a big factor that is an integral part of this fourth industrial revolution that hasn't been resolved and addressed, and even less so, there is a common view from different nations on how to deal with that. And last but not least, with the pace of the revolution or the pace of the innovation that we experience, there is no one single entity, whether it is a large corporation or a large government, that can deal with the complexity of the opportunity on a standalone basis. And so the notion of ecosystems of public and private, and how public and private can join forces to deal with the transformation, is the other big theme that I like to discuss with the panelists. And as I said, we have a unique set of panelists, extremely well qualified. I'm going to go from here, Fabio. Fabio Coelho has 20 plus years, they told me, of maybe a bit less, so you look younger, of international experience in sales, marketing, and general management in different industries. And very importantly, today is here as the country managing director of Google in Brazil. And Brazil is probably one of the widest presence of Google in outside the US in terms of units and divisions. So a very important perspective. Next to Mr. Coelho, Michael Gregoire. Thank you for joining us, Michael. Again, one of the luminaries of the technology industry from the Silicon Valley. Currently is the CEO of CA Technologies, and you will bring the perspective of the US and how probably you see that from your global role and what that implies in terms of the relative positioning of the different countries in the fourth industrial revolution. Minister Lieneke, María, Schol, Calle, bienvenida. Minister of Production for Peru, and a long experience in the private sector, where she's been with Microsoft and other technology firms for a number of years before joining government and support government with quite a demanding and interesting agenda of transformation. Professor Woods, she's the founding dean of the Blavatnik School of Government and professor of global economic governance at the University of Oxford, if I have it correctly. And she's also the founder of the Global Economic Governance Program and co-founder of the Oxford-Princeton Global Leadership Fellowship Program. So thank you for joining us. You will help me combining the views of public and private in a moment. Minister de Lima, thank you for joining. Welcome on stage. Being the Ministry of Industry in Brazil, I'm pretty sure that the audience will have a particular interest in knowing your opinion on how Brazil is going to deal with the fourth industrial revolution. But let me start with Mr. Gregoire and ask him about the perspective of somebody who lived the exponential growth of the digital revolution from the Silicon Valley, and what is that the lesson learned in the Silicon Valley that is quite specific to that, and what is reusable in the other parts of the world?
Oh, well, thank you. Well, first, I think we're still in the learning process, for sure. One of the beauties of Silicon Valley is innovation, and we tend to use software as the key innovation tool, building new products, building new platforms. And when you're building innovation, the way that we've done it in the past is we've never really bring concepts like security, privacy, all these big topics that we're challenging ourselves with right now. We sometimes don't also think of what does this technology solves a particular problem, and that's the intended consequence. What is the unintended consequence? You know, we've displaced a number of workers as well. And we don't really think about these bigger items that we absolutely have to in order for our industry to survive. And so we're grappling with that today. What is the role of technology companies with respect to reskilling people so that they can participate in the fourth industrial revolution? Very hot topic. Who's responsible for data? And who's responsible for protecting that data? And what can you do with that data once you have it? And how can you be responsible with that data now that you have it? And then when I think of Latin America in the context of the things that we're working through in the Silicon Valley and try to bring it into the discussion we're having here on Latin America, I'm more optimistic because Latin America definitely understands digital technology. It's the third biggest internet economy in the world. And what I would like to see in Latin America is go from being a consumer to being a producer. Start thinking through the innovation that you can have, and to the extent if you're starting out, do a better job than Silicon Valley has. Start thinking about privacy up front. Start thinking about security up front. Think about usability up front. And to the extent that you get to start from scratch, learn from some of the areas that we probably haven't done as good a job as we should, and we're trying to grapple with that now that we have millions of users and terabytes of data that we have to manage and protect and decide what to do with that data.
Yeah, well, I think that this point of data privacy, data ownership will come again and again during the discussion. Fabio, from your perspective, thinking about the way Google has developed globally and then in Latin America in particular, how do you see the private sector being an active part, a driver of the growth in Latin America when it comes to companies that have that particular digital DNA that Google has? Are there enough companies? You see that as a trend? I mean, back to the point of the Silicon Valley, the change has been when this digital DNA has grown exponentially. Is that something similar?
I guess even more so. Let me just first preface by saying it's a pleasure to be here and to share this panel with you guys here. A lot of important people and a lot of important people in the audience as well. What I think that we can take away from Google and the way we see these markets, there is an even greater opportunity here in Latin America when we consider that we have a chance to leapfrog some steps in the whole developmental process. Digitization in Brazil, especially in Brazil, there is an added component to that, which was the deep crisis that we faced in the last several years, 3, 4, 5 years. And that, I think, gave additional impetus to companies to experiment with new ways of doing business and to make sure they could capture everything they could about user behavior, understanding the consumer that has changed over the last years, and consumers changed in Brazil drastically. I remember in 2014, during the last World Cup, there were less than 45 million smartphones in Brazil. And today, I think we are in the second stage of a larger digital revolution. What we see is that we have about 135, 140 million smartphones, and people use that to improve their lifestyles. And also, of course, that abundance of content, that abundance of opportunity, of knowledge, allows for a new business environment as well. Give you an example, just so we can wrap the point. When we think about our campus here, Google has 6 campi worldwide. One of them is in São Paulo. A campus is a place, is a building here in São Paulo where entrepreneurs can go there and work. They have Wi-Fi, they have access to other entrepreneurs, other people. The campus in São Paulo was opened less than a year and a half ago. It has 105,000 members. About 600 people go there every day, and they connect with other entrepreneurs. So in the past, we would see great countries in Latin America, like Argentina, being like the first and premier place for innovation in the region. Today, Argentinians are great, but you can see that wave also in Brazil. So we are all combined, creating an ecosystem which is connected, where we have a lot of energy towards solving problems, and more importantly, attacking inefficiencies and creating jobs. I think that the ability to be an entrepreneur and to start up in this economy, it's not as great as in the Silicon Valley, because we don't have the right triangulation between universities, investors, and people wanting to invest, or Israel, but we're getting there. We are moving forward quickly in Latin America.
Well, that's it's very good, and if I reflect on this first part of the interaction, the perspective of the private sector seems to be more bullish, more optimistic in terms of what is in front of us in Brazil and in Latin America. Minister Schol, I asked the question in English, if you don't mind, and I know you understand, but then you decide we have the translation, and so we will be able to follow anyway. I think it's interesting to understand what the perspective of what is the perspective of a government in one of the countries that has good stability in terms of policies and has a trajectory of, like other countries in Latin America, of being able to implement specific programs that are defined by the government itself. Now, the point is, what is the pace, what is the complexity that you see in Latin America, where frankly, similar to Europe, it's about the individual country, but it's also about all the countries together.
I will start telling about the story in Peru and how we engage with Latin America regarding digital transformation. In the case of the country, we started the transformation about 1.5 years ago. I started that transformation in my previous job. And at that moment, it was like I have to start from zero. And I started looking at what other countries in Latin America were doing. And in that sense, I was very surprised, because we have countries like Uruguay, like Argentina, like Chile, that are very committed in the starting point of transformation and using technology to have impact in the citizen. So we have a association that's called Red Hat that we meet every month to share how we can impact the citizens using technology going towards the fourth industrial revolution. So in the case of us, what we have done, the starting point was, and you talk about data, how we can share data between the different agencies. Because in the countries, each agency is like, I own my information, it's for me, and I'm not going to share it. So we issued a law in about 1 year ago that every agency should put their information available for the other agencies, and our privacy law permits that. So we have an interoperability platform that the Prime Minister's office runs, and we started like with 20 services sharing data between the agencies, and right now we have about 100 services sharing data to have an impact to the citizens using technology. And what we have done regarding Latin America, or starting with Asia Pacific, is like sharing this experience also, and how we can share information between the countries, so we can like simplify processes between the countries. So it's like we think that we are not like, as Latin America, working together towards going to the fourth industrial revolution, but there are lots of initiatives that we are working together.
That's again encouraging, and we'll come back to how governments will need to enable that transformation and that acceleration. Minister de Lima, Brazil. When I came a couple of days ago, and I've been visiting clients for the last 2 days here in São Paulo. And there are two contradicting aspects that I hear, I've been hearing for the last couple of days. On one end, there is a substantial concern about the social implications of the fourth revolution. And so the potential risk of jobs being replaced, somebody can say the actual risk more than potential risk of jobs being replaced. And some of the and in the meantime, I say that some of the clients that I met were saying, we have a number of open positions that we cannot fulfill because we don't find the people with the skills that are required to be part of these digital programs, digital transformation programs. So there is this element of a perceived big opportunity on one end, but elements that can keep Brazil back and need to be addressed. How do you see Brazil taking on the opportunity, because I see the opportunity of being a big player and a front runner for Latin America, but frankly, also for the rest of the world?
Bom, muito obrigado pela pergunta. Antes de mais nada, eu quero pedir.
Thank you very much for the question. I was in a conference press, and this was the launch of the national agenda for the Industry 4.0. So this is why I could not arrive here earlier. But this question is very interesting. As a government, we have a concern to requalify or re-educate our labor, especially right now, when we are now designing a new strategy for the 4.0 industry. I was also paying attention very closely to this, about the phases of the industry, to get to know the mechanical industry, electrical revolution, now the automation, now the robotics revolution with the big data. And we're working together with the Ministry of Education so that we, and my Minister for Land, former Minister of the Industry Ministry, so we're working together with this new education of people so that inevitably there will be a shift to other activities. So people will be moving to other activities, and so this is what requires more skill-based development. So we are now focusing on now building the skills of these people based on these needs, and we want the industry to get modernized so that it can be more productive and also be more competitive. But of course, we cannot forget this labor that has to build new skills. So this is why this is part of the strategy that we are focusing now for the 4.0 industry. So we have this concern, and this is why this is right in the it is in the core of the agenda of the Brazilian government right now.
I don't know what it's mean. Yes, because it gets closer to the mic. Professor Woods, as promised, I get to you last, but for a reason. We heard the private sector taking an optimistic view, the government sector being a bit more prudent, and yet more on, yes, we are doing things. There are things that we understand represent a barrier to the rapid expansion of the fourth revolution and fourth industrial revolution, and we are working on it at a local level, a regional level. Mm-hmm. You've done a lot of research, and you work with a number of governments. Are there best practices that you've seen, or ways that government have started dealing with this need of aligning or removing some of the barriers in a way that allows this industrial revolution to accelerate and make a real impact to the widest part of the population of countries?
Yeah, thank you, and what a pleasure to be here. I think there's governments everywhere in the world are facing three very big, I call them gaps, that technology and the private sector can really help them reduce. So that the first gap is the gap between politicians and citizens, where technology, I think the best practice cases are where politicians are using technology to communicate much more closely, effectively, to mobilize, to listen, to get feedback from their constituencies. And that points us to a much more responsive political system. And that's, and here in Brazil, you can see citizen-driven projects that are trying to do that in at least 14 cities. So I think that's on the positive. The challenge with the technology is the one that we all know, which is that we live in very diverse societies. And when Facebook or Google or whatever starts channeling information, curating information, sending it over private channels, and it turns out to be toxic or propaganda or divisive or hate speech or language which would otherwise be banned, then we have a problem. And to me there's a very clear solution. I'm sure my fellow panelists might disagree with me, but I think there we just have to treat the so-called platform companies as publishers. And we have to do that to protect our democracy and so that we can use technology to build more cohesive, more integrated societies and not more fragmented and fearful societies. And so I welcome the initiatives in the World Economic Forum that are trying to bring both the tech sector and the political sector together to think about how to do that, how to use the technology to bring our society together. The second gap is the gap between ever-increasing citizens' expectations. For example, in health, more and more expensive treatments are available, citizens are living longer, they're needing more, and yet governments are more and more strapped for cash. So how do we start bridging that gap? Well, there again, I think technology helps us enormously. It can make for a quicker, less bureaucratic, more informed, more responsive system with much less wastage. But at the core of that lies what probably all three panelists have touched on, which is the issue of data and who owns the data. Because a perfectly responsive system would have government having access to every piece of your data so that they could perfectly respond to it. But I think citizens in most democracies are profoundly uneasy with that. Why? Well, 200 years of thinking about what liberty means. The state, the government, is the one actor in every society that can use coercive force against you, that can imprison you, that can punish you. And so citizens are necessarily a little wary about giving every piece of information about themselves to that government. And what I think we're seeing emerge are three different models. So there's one model where the government asserts rights to that data. And I think that we're seeing that in China, both formally and informally. And we're seeing it in some other countries, and it's quite attractive to some governments. On the other side, in the United States, I think we're seeing a model where it's the private sector that asserts rights to data. And I don't know if that's a correct characterization of Google or Facebook or whatever, but it feels as though, or Apple, that they're asserting a right to our data. And then in the middle, I see Europe trying to forge regulation that says actually it's citizens that have rights to their data. And I think we're living through a moment where every one of us in each of our societies has to think, well, who do we think should assert control over data, and how should that be actually utilized? Because if we can sort that, the possibilities for improving both private sector and government responsiveness through information are huge. And then the third, just sorry to be a bit lengthy, but the third is the inequality gap, right? And that's quite a vicious one, because across the world's wealthiest, 23 out of 25 wealthy countries, half the population over the last decade have seen their wages decrease or at least stagnate. And then at the top end, we're seeing the returns, particularly in the tech sector, exponentially increase. So we're seeing societies that are becoming hugely more unequal. And it's some of the tech sector leaders that have been thinking about this and saying, we've got to think about this. Do we tax robots? Like, how do we come at this problem? Well, I think technology can really help. If you think about what Amazon and Alibaba and other platforms are doing, they're opening global markets to some very small producers that would have had no chance ever of selling across global markets. So there's a real possibility here that technology can help us to increase opportunities even for some of the smallest rural communities. But at the same time, I think this the issue of tech companies being large monopolies and being untouchable by governments, and that's definitely not how it feels for the tech sector. I think that governments are just stopping them innovating and stopping them from doing good things. But I think from a lot of citizens, and I speak in Europe, we've got to a point where the big tech companies, when you ask citizens in polls, the first words they say are they don't pay tax, right? So we've got to actually come up with a new social compact between our tech sector and governments and citizens, where we get that piece of it right, so that governments can actually take forward an agenda which addresses what will otherwise be a very exponentially increasing inequality. So for me, the fourth industrial revolution has real opportunities for narrowing those three gaps, and then some challenges that the private and public sector are going to have to work very fast to resolve.
And it is, I think, reflecting on what you say, every single component of the barriers that you describe, or the challenges, are somehow unprecedented, because this notion of breaking through the boundaries of countries, having this polarization of technology companies versus non-technology, China becoming a bigger player than ever, are somehow unprecedented. And so there isn't a story that we can look at and say and learn from. Is something new that needs to be discussed and resolved. And clearly, the risk is that that element of agreement may take longer than what we would like to be achieved. So that is probably the big concern when we think about this fourth revolution.
I mean, I wouldn't want to put all the problems together and say it's just too big to solve, because I don't think it is. I think if we can sort
one by one,
the publication issue, if we can sort the who owns data issue, and if we can sort the social compact between companies and governments, then I think we can sort it.
Fair enough, fair enough. And in 20 years from now, we'll say, okay, it was easy. We couldn't see that 20 years ago, but it was easy. Opening up to the audience here, we've heard the different perspectives. So it's more positive than not, which is good. It's a good starting point. But there are aspects of this evolution, revolution, innovation that requires interventions, and everybody is aware. But nobody in any country in the world seems to have found the magic recipe to get everything resolved. So your perspective, questions to the panelists on what has been discussed so far, on what has not been discussed so far.
Good afternoon. I'm Eduardo from Global Shapers Communities, Florianopolis Hub. I'm also work with entrepreneurial education. And one of the things that we are seeing in Brazil nowadays, and like Gregoire said, not to be a consumer, but a producer. And one thing that we always talk about is how to be a new Silicon Valley. And we are in Latin America, in any other part of the world, will exist a new Silicon Valley. So, what can we do on your perspective? What is the values? What is Brazilian and Latin American skills that can accelerate the process to go into the fourth industrial revolution like a top one or a high player? Thank you.
Want to go first?
Yeah, I think I can go first, and then we can go around here. First, our minister just told us today about the launch of the program. I've been part of the Conselhão in Brasilia, working with many important, like a cross-functional group from several ministries of our government. And you can see that there is, from our government, there is a desire to become more digital. And that desire to become more digital, it may translate into lower costs, more convenience, better services. And that's all, actually that's a lot of what we need here in order to rebalance our budgets and to make sure that we offer services to all this 206 million Brazilians. I guess that's part number one. There is a commitment, there is a vision around that. Part number two, I guess, as much as we think about government as an enabler, we cannot count on government's money to do that. We can count on their support. We can count on the IEDB, the famous BID, that can have programs. But I think it's up to all the companies to try to foster an ecosystem, and all the private equity companies and all the investors, because what we're seeing here, and you're doing that in Florianopolis, it's the moment that we have, which allows for, first there was a democratization of access. People had access, and we became a global society, and people in Florianopolis can have the same opportunities to invest or to become an entrepreneur as anyone in Israel, in Tel Aviv, which is beautiful. The second part of that, I think, is the opportunity to democratize the chances to have a business and to become a global player, and we have some unicorns. There was a discussion earlier today on unicorns. But that's a combination of companies that can create this critical mass, working with investors and working with the universities, or some sort of formal education around that. I think all these hubs are important. And when I go back to the whole notion of the startup ecosystem, I think there are a few other components that we need to have clarity around. One, and I agree with the professor from the UK, one is that we at Google believe in responsible tech. And responsible tech means we pay taxes. We pay more than 1.8 billion in taxes in Brazil. The second part, which is important, there's got to be trust around data. Users have the option, have the tools, and the data belongs to the user. That's the mindset that we expect. Of course, the user may let that, there's an optionality that the users may let that data be used if they see value, if they see convenience. But also they have tools that they can take down the data and they can navigate anonymous or incognito in most platforms. That discussion is happening as we speak. And I think it's really important that we as a society will sort out what are the limits and the boundaries of using of the common set of data that we can create together. Of course, by having that common set of data available within certain boundaries, we can work in problems that individually we can't. Let me pick, just to finalize, an example of something that we are the #1 in the world in Brazil, which is Waze. Waze is a Google platform that was created in Israel, and we have about 4 million people using Waze in the city of São Paulo. It's the #1 in the world. And why is that?
You have the worst traffic.
Because we have the... Absolutely, that's the whole point, yeah. Because we are inefficient. Because we are inefficient. There is an inefficient in traffic, that there is a solution that based on collaboration, and all of us see value on that. I was in Bogota, it's amazing as well. People use that all the time, and they were like, because citizens see value, and they don't see harm in making that data available, and the usage, the conditions for privacy are respected there. I think the tech companies are coming to a point where they need to behave, as we are saying. Google believes in responsible tech. We think that we have a role in this game, and we think that more so than that, if we don't do this, we are exposed to a global society where companies and countries that do not advance, they will be left behind. And we need to address that sentiment in a way that we are positive, we're proactive in creating solutions and addressing the areas where people feel there is risk or harm, so that we can come out stronger as a country or as a region in Latin America.
So, Minister de Lima, the question was for Brazil, and so I'm asking whether you have an answer to the question. And in the meantime, what I hear from Google is that they are recommending you not to solve the problem of the traffic in São Paulo, because otherwise Waze will not be used the same way. So
we're not expecting the government to solve the problem of the traffic. I would say, let me put it in a better way, right?
Bom, o que nós entendemos é que o governo tem que criar as condições favoráveis, né, para o desenvolvimento da inovação. Estava aqui falando da agenda e não...
Agenda, and more particularly about the government in terms of resources and so on, but also to guiding this private sector and how they can convert this into a 4.0 industry. So our purpose in the next 8 years is to leave from less than 5% to achieve more than 15% of industries having adopted this concept of 4.0. So this is what many people already know. But specifically for innovation, startups, and so on, at the Ministry of Industry, we have a couple of projects that we are now working on. For example, Innovative Brazil is an accelerator that has now been recognized as a Zen startup, and it was voted as the best accelerator in Brazil. So we also have the Start Out that is for the internationalization of these companies. It was promoted in Argentina and France. We'll be working in 8 countries, so we are taking innovative companies and startups to all these countries. And also we have startup industry. So we have 50 million companies through BDI to start up the demand of the big companies according to what the startups can provide as solutions. So this is all in place. So this is just to mention 3 programs to say that obviously, because one of the concerns that we have is, and we're working hardly on this, like the Portal Único do Comércio, foreign trade portal. So this is to have less than 1.5% of impact on the GDP according to the Tulio Vargas Foundation Index. So also with programs that can stimulate all this so that the new ideas can come up, and we want to use our creative capacity. So this is why we think that the government expects that the youth, especially the youth, can be increasingly more engaged in seeking innovation in Brazil. So we in the government, especially for the Ministry of Industry, we are willing to continue moving forward with all these programs I've mentioned to you.
Quick questions, quick answers. I'm sorry.
Throw in on that last question, because it's such a great question. How can Brazil create Silicon Valley? And all I wanted to throw in was there's some fabulous research that was done at Stanford looking at the biotech sector, where the United States invested, the government actually invested quite a lot in trying to build 12 different centers for biotech. And so they, Woody Powell and DiMaggio went in and said, why did 4 of them work and the other 8 didn't? So I think it's worth learning from. And it's very much what Fabio said. It's the combination of universities, entrepreneurs, of some government facilitation and finance. So you need that combination. But the 4 places that work were the 4 places that had by far the densest interactions among those 4 groups. And the 8 that didn't work, the pieces were there, but there just weren't the dense interactions required. And I think it's worth looking at that, because it's not old-fashioned industrial policy that will work, but it's curating these kind of hubs, and some will fail and some will succeed. Sorry, that was just a footnote.
Perfect point. Perfect point. Thank you.
My name is Marco Souza. I'm at the Ministry from Brazil for Industry. My question is for you, Casati, and also for Michael Gregoire. The same question. First, a lot of was told here about workforce skill for Fourth Industrial Revolution. My question is, what is this kind of skills for Fourth Industrial Revolution? What's the difference of these skills that we are doing now? The first question. And the second question is about what's the difference from workforce skills training for Fourth Industrial Revolution for Latin America countries? Because one thing is when Germany, Japan, or US train their workforce to use complex and modern machines that will require new skills, but these new machines are brand new. And they are used to use machines with average age of 3-4 years. Here in Brazil, the average is around 19 years on average of the Brazilian manufacturing industry. So what happens in Latin America and in Brazil why you have to train these people if the companies are not using this kind of technologies and they are not even considering to use these new technologies? So how is the situation here in Latin America?
In Latin America.
And also, what is this mysterious workforce training secret for the Fourth Industrial Revolution?
Okay, very good. You want to go first?
Sure. Well, if we could come back with the most basic thing, if you want to participate in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, I think it's a capability that everybody has an intrinsic ability to do, and you've heard it from Ngaire, and you've heard it from Fabio. It's collaboration. When you take a look at most of the software that was developed, it was developed by lone wolves. You know, when Bill Gates first wrote the Microsoft operating system, him and Paul Allen wrote most of it themselves. Steve Jobs with Wozniak, almost by themselves. Sergey pretty much wrote most of the code by themselves. So the idea of the lone wolf coming up with the innovation by themselves, I think it's a dead habit. If you want to scale, and if you want to do something that affects millions of people, you're going to have to collaborate. So if you want to have a successful startup, the methodology for doing that right now is the Agile Manifesto and an Agile development, which means you have a Scrum, and in your Scrum, you're going to have a finance person, you're going to have a salesperson, you're going to have a database administrator, you're going to have a business analyst, you might have a researcher from a university, you might have a government official in your Scrum. To the extent that you have skills that enable you to communicate with people and the desire to work with people and the skill set that makes most teams successful is they're diverse. Homogeneous teams are not nearly as successful as diverse teams. So I think that's something you can just put in the back of your mind, and that sounds a little bit up in the sky, and I'll bring it down to something very, very simple and something actionable. There are a handful of skills that you need to be digitally aware. One of the things we've done at the WEF in the IT Governors Forum, which is the group of IT companies, Google being one of them that participates, all the CEOs, we kind of drop all of our weapons at the door, and sometimes we drop our egos, and we come into a room and we say, hey, look it, in order for our industry to be successful, we have to think much bigger and much broader. And one of the things that is not lost on any of us is in order for people to use digital technology, they have to be digitally aware. And we do have a skill shortage on a global basis. One of the things that is becoming very aware is the digital skills decline. Most of us think it's blue-collar workers, people working in factories. It's not. It's white-collar workers as well. In the next 5 years, there will be 6 million white-collar workers displaced by technology. Now, we'll go ahead and add 2 to 2.5 million jobs as well. But the issue we're having is there's nobody to fill those jobs. So you're going to see unemployment creep in just about every single G7 economy. So we have understood that that is a big problem for society and a big problem for our industry. And if we wait for governments to try to solve that problem, I think that they're not capable, and it's an unrealistic expectation. We understand the problem better. And if we can pool together and help solve it, I think society will be a bit better off. Our businesses will be better off. So what we did is 11 companies founded what's called the Skills Portal. We put our own proprietary training into this portal. PwC did a very nice job of putting a free assessment on the portal, so you can go through the assessment on the portal and get an understanding of what is your digital aptitude. And from that digital aptitude, there's 6 tracks you can take right now that gives you an opportunity to take training for free that's digitally aware. First generation of this, it's coming out at the back end of March. It's English only, and it's definitely targeted at the people that have been in the workforce for about 5 years. It's not trying to boil the ocean and solve every single problem with respect to skills disparity, but it's a starting point. And we're going to continue to iterate this in an agile forum, trying to bring as many people into it as we can. I'm out hunting for CEOs and dollars to fund it. So every tech CEO is getting a phone call from me, and I'm getting Klaus and the WEF to help me doing funding to get this out. But I'm very passionate that this is a step forward. It's something we can materially point to, that we're going to help people. And our goal is to have a million people retrained by 2021. So a concrete step, a first step, not nearly broad enough to solve the biggest problem, the bigger problem, but it's definitely something concrete and material. And I think if we can get that done, we can get other people to carry the torch. And perhaps pharmaceutical takes the next step, and how do they help people get into the economy using digital skills? Maybe it's accounting, maybe it's a different form.
So the mysterious is less mysterious after what Michael presented. And you can take every single function in any single company, in every single industry, and say, whether it's sales, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's distribution, whether it's finance and accounting, every single one of those are impacted by being transformed by digital technology. So that is one aspect of the hard component, knowing these technologies apply to that specific function, and the soft components that Michael referred to, the ability to collaborate, the ability to work in multidisciplinary teams, the idea to co-create is a methodology, is a mindset that the workforce of 30, 40 years ago didn't necessarily have as it is required today. On your point of the industry, the manufacturing in Brazil, the point there is frankly that the competition is on productivity. And there are countries, and Brazil is one of them, China is one of them, where the labor cost is no longer a competitive factor, because there is no cheap labor cost in Brazil or in China compared to other countries. And so the way you can increase productivity is by using different manufacturing processes and techniques. And the equation has to be squared somehow, because if that productivity equation doesn't compute, Brazil has an issue of competitiveness structurally.
If I can make a comment, I think this is too important to be left aside of the discussion, and we have a responsibility having 2 or 3 ministers here and a few CEOs. It's important to nail the discussion also about the need for STEM, especially STEM for girls. I think we have an obligation, and we have to influence the curriculum in a way that our kids learn more about science, technology, engineering, and math, because eventually that will lead into coding, that will lead into programming, that will lead into a society which is more tech-savvy overall. It's not only digitally speaking, but about our ability to create a more tech-savvy society. That is an opportunity for us, and if we don't do enough, we may not create the right opportunities for our kids. And on top of that, that's a risk for us, because if you look at the amount of engineers that are graduating today that are good in AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, there's a lot coming from China. So we have to play catch up on that game already. We're already behind as a group. And if we don't want to resign to a position where we are only importers of technology, I think we have an obligation to create the foundation. And that means, for one end, we work on STEM, we work on coding, we work on programs for our kids, especially for girls, that we have a problem today that not that many young women, they have access or they have the incentives to become tech savvy. AI. If we do that right, I think we can have a chance to have this massive amount of people in Latin America, almost 400 million people, in a nice way, or more than 400 million people, in a nice way, becoming more digital savvy.
Time is over, Minister Schol. The last comment from you on this point of how education can be aligned with the demand of new skills, taking the perspective of what Fabio says about STEM and about promoting gender equality in the moment we want to transform the society, taking advantage of the fourth revolution.
I would say we have to work in the short and the long term. The short term is, like you said, the initiative that you are going to have to transform the actual professionals to be digital in one way. And the other way where the government has a role play, a very important role play, is the long term. No? Have enough people that can be in this process of transformation with the skills that we need, data scientists, the ones that we need for the transformation. But at the end, it's also how we can make, in the case of the girls, make it important to be part of. There are some initiatives. In the case of Peru, we have one initiative that is working very, very well. It's called Laboratoria. Laboratoria works with girls that already finished the school in programming. They work with them for more than 1 year. But the important thing is at the end, they have work. So initiatives like that, I think we have to promote all over to have the girls work in these kind of jobs that usually you think that's for men, not for boys and not for girls, but it works.
Very good, very good. That's a positive note. The right point to stop. We run out of time, and there is no time to summarize. But if you reflect on what has been said throughout the panel, there are components of the solution that you put together, and as Professor Wood says, is breaking down the problem into elementary blocks and dealing with the elementary blocks is probably the right way for both private and public institutions. Thank you, Minister de Lima. Thank you, Professor Woods. Thank you, Minister Schol. Thank you, Mr. Gregoire and Fabio. Thank you all.